One of the other questions people tend to have, and then let's jump into the doctrine, but one of the other questions people tend to have, and maybe I'll just steal your scriptures here since they're open in the right spot, are the facsimiles, right? Because Joseph Smith, well, we don't know for sure that it's Joseph Smith that writes these explanations, but one way or the other, he certainly approves of them. So I'm just going to say Joseph Smith says this. Whether he was the author, he intends to say this by publishing it. He gives us explanations of facsimile 1, of facsimile 2, and facsimile 3, right? And people tend to want to know, and this can get quite complex. We're going to give a very simplified version here, but people tend to want to know, does what Joseph Smith say match what they mean? Does Joseph Smith say what they mean match what the ancient Egyptians would have said they meant? And that's a problematic thing in two ways. All right, one, we don't have any ancient Egyptians handy to ask, right? It turns out they're all dead. So the closest we can come is to ask someone like myself, an Egyptologist, all right? And again, the difficulty is that these documents are from about 200 BC. So by this time, you have the kinds of characters and figures we see in here and these kinds of drawings. You have several thousand years of history of symbolic interpretation. And it changes over time. And we don't have as much documentation for this time as we do for, say, some other time periods. So just as an example, the kind of drawing that is facsimile 2 is, and we call it a hypocephalus.
Which means behind the head.
Yeah, that's right. It's designed to go under the head and give the person directions and light and ability to get where they want to be in the afterlife and be the kind of being they want to be in the afterlife.
So you wouldn't have this on a pillow for a living person.
No.
You would have this on a pillow in a pyramid or in some grave, in a tomb.
In a tomb, yeah. Yeah. So, but this kind of, you see there are several figures in here, and even among Egyptologists, there was an agreement as to what they meant. There were some who said, okay, this figure means this, and this figure means this, and some others who said this figure means this, and this figure means this, and so on. And so there was disagreement already. But then a good friend and colleague of mine at BYU, his name is John Gee, who's become one of the greatest experts on hypocephali in Egyptology. He finally found one where they actually labeled a number of those characters, and it turns out that it was rare for the Egyptologists to, either one of those camps, to be agreeing with what the ancient Egyptians from that time period were saying, right? So this just shows us that we can't just go and ask Egyptologists what an ancient Egyptian would have thought these meant, because we may or may not be right. It's a complex process we're dealing with, and we may or may not actually know.
That's really profound. That when John found that idea that, whoa, the consensus today turns out to not line up with what these...
And there wasn't even a consensus. There were two different consensuses, right?
And neither one of them were right.
Are right most of the time. Yeah, yeah, that's right. That's we need a little humility as academics to say, sometimes we just can't figure this out, and that's worth knowing. So again, going back to those alphabet and grammars or the translation process, I have to say, or when he translated what the source was, I have to say, if I'm going to be honest, we can't tell. We don't have enough data to tell. That's important, and in this case, we don't have enough data to really compare well what the ancient Egyptians would have said these meant compared to what Joseph Smith said they meant. Now, in some cases, we can do a decent job, or at least give it a very educated estimation or guess or treatise. And often it does match up well, like surprisingly often it matches up. I'm often surprised at, like, oh, I didn't expect that to match so well, but it did. So often it does match up well. But there's another problem. I'm not sure we're even asking the right question when we want to compare and say, did what Joseph Smith said these meant match what the ancient Egyptians would have said they meant? What if Joseph Smith was telling us what a group of ancient Jews would have said they meant? Right? So we know that Jews take Egyptian drawings, Egyptian stories, Egyptian elements of culture, and they give them their own interpretation. In fact, they often substitute Abraham for Osiris or Abraham for someone else in those scenes. Even Christ did that in the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. That's actually an Egyptian story, and he swapped Osiris for Abraham in that story. Right? So it's the kind of thing that we see happening quite a bit. So it's possible that that's what we should be saying, is how would an ancient Jew in Egypt at the time have interpreted this? And the answer is we don't have enough data to know. It's also possible, remember I told you that there were groups of priests in Thebes at the time that this papyrus was created. who were collecting stories from Jewish religious figures and incorporating them into their own religious rites. And so they absolutely would have had a mixing of Egyptian and Jewish elements and drawn a different kind of interpretation out because of that. So since this is a priest in Thebes that owns these drawings, at least Facsimile 1 and 2, we don't know as much about the one who owned Facsimile 3,
Facsimile 1 and 3.
Yeah, it's an Egyptian priest who owns Facsimile 1 and 3. We don't know as much about the owner of Facsimile 2, but it's really a very good likelihood. From an academic perspective, we have to say there's a decent likelihood that he would have had an amalgamated or syncretistic interpretation of these drawings, meaning he would draw out things that were influenced by both Egyptian and Jewish religious thought. But again, we don't have enough data to know what that would have been.
Kerry, this is so helpful, this reminder that we need copious amounts of humility and meekness when we enter this discussion, because our assumptions, they're so potentially fraught with error at any one of these phases through history, or from different cultures borrowing or reading in. It's just very, very helpful.
And frankly, these questions that arise with the Book of Abraham, a Book of Abraham studies, and issues that people have and struggles they have, it really generally arises from what we'd call hubris, or academic arrogance, feeling like we can say more and do more than we can, and people are led away by that arrogance and that overreaching and overstating of academic abilities, whereas a dose of humility would be helpful for everyone.
That's beautiful.
And I'll also say it may be that Joseph Smith is just telling us what we should get out of them spiritually, regardless. It may be that it's being revealed to him what he should teach the Latter-day Saints and what they should learn from it. So in the end, again, we have to just admit we don't know.
So at the end of that discussion, I think it kind of ties into the similar concept in the Book of Mormon, with the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. And you get that great passage in 2 Nephi 27, which contains more variation from its Isaiah equivalent in the Bible than any of our other Isaiah chapters in the Book of Mormon. And it's there where you get this coming forth of the book and the words of the book being given, and he's pretty careful how he separates out the book from the words of the book, the plates versus the translation. And then you get those two verses where God says, I am able to do mine own work. Yeah. And it's the academics of the world, the intelligentsia, if you will, they can't explain it, but I'm able to do mine own work. I got this. Yeah. And I think we need to bring some of that into the Book of Abraham as well, as God's voice echoing in the back of our mind with him saying, I know what I'm doing. Yeah. And I know how to do this when it comes to Scripture.
And I think that's where I've written about this several times, the idea that we should recognize our different avenues of learning, value them all, but recognize what they're capable of doing. So there are several different avenues of learning, but let's compare kind of the academic method with the revelatory method, right? We should pursue both. Absolutely, God tells us to study in our heart and our mind, and by studying faith and all sorts of other things, right? But we need to recognize the limitations we've just talked about with the academic method. And if we're trying to figure out the things of God, the academic method can only take us so far, and that's not very far. If you want to find out the things of God, at least Paul teaches us, you better learn it from God. It doesn't make any sense to the world. It only makes sense if it comes from God. And that's the method that can teach us those things that the academic method is not prepared to give us. And so both can help us understand the Book of Abraham, but only one is going to be able to help us understand the truth of the Book of Abraham.
That's beautiful.
The other's not capable.